Turn 1-Acre into a 5-figure enterprise growing high-demand medicinal flowers. Most farmers are struggling on hundreds of acres, but you can generate a 5-figure income on just one. By swapping commodity crops for high-demand medicinal blooms like Calendula and Echinacea, you tap into the premium apothecary market. Stop selling to wholesalers and start selling direct to makers for maximum botanical profits today. Visual: drone shot descends over a modest 1-acre field, orange and gold, calendula blossoms rippling in the wind, a small red barn in the background. Cut to a close-up of hands gently cutting a flower head and dropping it into a canvas harvest bag. Narrator: VO. Somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, on a plot of land smaller than a football field, a woman named Rosalind Carter is doing something most of her neighbors think is a little bit crazy. While the farm next door plants 300 acres of soybeans and prays for a decent commodity price, Rosalind has 1 acre, one single acre, and she is on track to clear over $40,000 from it this year. Not gross, not projected, actual profit. This is the quiet, steady arithmetic of specialty medicinal flower farming, and today we're going to walk through exactly how it works. The planting, the harvesting, the drying, the selling, and the real numbers behind turning a single acre into a 5-figure enterprise. The problem with commodity farming visual. Wide shot of an industrial combine harvesting corn under a hazy sky. Cut to a chart showing corn and soybean price history, flatlining for years. Narrator: VO. Here's the uncomfortable truth about commodity agriculture. If you grow corn, soybeans, or wheat, you are competing in a global market where the price is set by everyone else. Massive industrial operations in Iowa, Brazil, and Ukraine, and you have almost no control over what you get paid. Margins on commodity row crops often run $50 to $150 per acre in a good year, before accounting for equipment depreciation, fuel, and rising fertilizer costs. To make a real living from commodity crops, you typically need scale, hundreds or thousands of acres, plus expensive machinery and a tolerance for thin margins. That model locks out the small landowner, or the couple who inherited 5 acres from grandma. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, standing at the edge of her field. When my husband and I bought this property, we had exactly 1 acre of usable open ground. Everyone told us that wasn't enough to do anything serious with. What they didn't understand is that an acre of soybeans and an acre of echinacea are not the same asset. One pays you in cents per pound. The other pays you in dollars per pound, sometimes tens of dollars per pound, depending on the product and the buyer. Why medicinal flowers changed the math visual. Close-up shots of Calendula officinalis in full bloom, bright orange petals, bees working the flowers. Cut to Echinacea purpurea, purple coneflowers standing tall, seed heads forming. Narrator: VO. The herbal products industry in the United States has grown into a multi-billion-dollar market, and a huge portion of that demand is for raw and semi-processed botanical material. Dried flowers, petals, roots, and extracts that go into tinctures, salves, teas, capsules, and skincare products. Two of the most reliable, most requested medicinal flowers in that supply chain are Calendula and Echinacea. Calendula, sometimes called pot marigold, is prized for its anti-inflammatory and skin-healing properties. It shows up in salves, creams, oils, and soaps. It is relatively easy to grow, blooms repeatedly through the season if you keep deadheading and harvesting, and dries beautifully for long-term storage. Echinacea, the purple coneflower, is one of the most recognized immune support herbs on the market. Herbalists and supplement makers want the flower heads, the leaves, and often the root, which commands a premium because it takes 2 to 3 years to mature. Visual: split screen. Left side shows a truck loading soybeans at a grain elevator. Right side shows small glass jars of dried calendula petals being weighed on a kitchen scale. Narrator: VO. Here is the core arbitrage. Commodity crops are priced by the bushel, sold into a market with essentially infinite supply and a single buyer type, the grain elevator. Medicinal flowers are priced by the pound, sold into a market with dozens of buyer types. Herbalists, apothecaries, soap makers, tea companies, and direct consumers. When supply is tight and buyers are plentiful, the grower, not the middleman, captures the value, laying out the One-Acre plan visual. Overhead illustration of a 1-acre plot divided into raised beds, labeled sections for Calendula, Echinacea, and a small pollinator buffer strip, and a narrator, VO. Let's get concrete. 1 acre is about 560 square feet. After accounting for pathways, a small equipment turnaround area, and a pollinator buffer strip along the edges, a realistic planted area is around 30,000 to 34,000 square feet. Call it 3/4 of an acre of actual production space. A common layout splits the space roughly in half. Half in Calendula, which is an annual that can be replanted or succession sown multiple times per season, and half in Echinacea, which is a perennial that will take a year or two to reach full productive maturity, but then produces reliably for several years afterward. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, walking through rows. We laid our beds out 4 feet wide with 18-inch walking paths. That spacing lets us hand weed easily and get a wheel hoe through without damaging the plants. In our Calendula section, we plant at about 12-inch spacing, which gives us roughly 3 plants per square foot of bed. In the Echinacea section, we go a little wider, about 18 inches, since those plants get bigger and we're managing them for multiple seasons. The planting calendar visual. Animated calendar graphic ticking through the months, with icons appearing for seed starting, transplanting, and harvest windows, narrator, VO. Timing matters enormously in flower farming. For a grower in USDA Zone 6, a typical year looks like this. In late February, calendula seed is started indoors under grow lights, roughly 6 to 8 weeks before the last expected frost. Echinacea, if starting from seed, is also started around this time, though many first-year growers buy bare-root Echinacea plants to shortcut the slow germination period. In early April, once the danger of a hard freeze has passed, calendula transplants go into the field. Calendula is frost-tolerant and can go out earlier than most warm-season flowers. In mid to late April, Echinacea transplants or root divisions go into their permanent beds. By early June, the first calendula blooms are ready, and from that point forward, harvesting happens 2 to 3 times per week for the rest of the season. Because calendula responds to frequent cutting by producing more flowers. By late June or July, first-year Echinacea plants are establishing themselves, but not yet in full flower production. Second year and beyond, Echinacea flowers heavily from June through August, and the roots, if harvested, are typically dug in fall of the second or third year. Farmer Rosalind, on camera. The single biggest mistake new growers make is underestimating how often calendula needs to be picked. If you let the flowers go to seed, the plant thinks its job is done and slows way down. We're out here every other day at minimum during peak season, sometimes daily, cutting flowers at the base of the bloom just as the petals are fully open. Daily life on a Medicinal flower farm visual. Time-lapse sunrise over the field. Cut to Rosalind and a helper walking rows with harvest baskets at 6:30 a.m. narrator. VO. A day in the life here starts early, and for good reason, flowers harvested in the cool morning hours, before the heat of the day has stressed the plant, hold their essential oils and color better, which matters enormously to buyers who are paying premium prices for premium quality. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, mid-harvest. We're out here by 6:30 most mornings during peak season. Calendula gets snapped off right where the flower head meets the stem. You want the whole flower head with a little bit of stem intact for handling, but the buyers want just the flower heads for processing, so that little stem gets trimmed later during the drying and cleaning stage. Echinacea we harvest a bit differently. We're cutting the flower with a few inches of stem attached, because some of our buyers actually want the stem and leaf material included for tincture work. while others want flower heads only, so we sort as we go. Visual. Close-up of harvested flowers being laid out in single layers on mesh drying racks in a converted shed. Narrator. VO. After harvest, the flowers go straight to the drying operation, and this is where a lot of the actual value gets created. Fresh Calendula and Echinacea are worth very little on their own. It's the properly dried, properly stored, high-quality product that commands real prices, the drying and processing operation. Visual. Interior shot of a repurposed outbuilding fitted with mesh drying racks, a dehumidifier, and a box fan for airflow. Narrator. VO. Rosalind converted an old tool shed into a dedicated drying room. The setup is simple and inexpensive. Stacked mesh screen racks that allow airflow from all sides, a dehumidifier to pull moisture out of the air, and fans to keep air circulating so mold doesn't have a chance to take hold. Farmer Rosalind on camera, standing in the drying shed. We built these racks out of untreated pine and window screen material for maybe $200 total. The dehumidifier was another $150. That's the entire capital investment in our processing setup, and it handles our whole harvest. Flowers go on the racks in a single layer, not touching each other, and they typically take anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks to fully dry, depending on humidity and airflow. We know they're done when the petals feel papery and snap rather than bend. Visual. Close-up of dried calendula petals being separated from the flower head by hand, falling into a large bin. Narrator. VO. Once dry, calendula flowers are often processed further, separating the bright orange petals from the flower head, since many buyers specifically want loose petals for cosmetic and skincare use, which commands a higher price than whole dried flower heads. This separation is done by hand or with a simple mesh sieve, and it's labor-intensive, but it's also where a grower can meaningfully increase the value of their harvest. Dried product then goes into airtight containers, away from light and moisture, until it's ready to ship or be picked up by a buyer. Duyo actually buys this stuff. Visual. Montage, a small batch soap maker in her home studio, a tea company's packaging line, an herbalist's apothecary shop with wall-to-wall glass jars. Narrator. VO. This is the part most people don't understand until they're in it. The market for dried medicinal flowers is not one single market. It's a patchwork of buyer types, each with different needs, different volumes, and different price points. Herbalists and small apothecaries buy in modest quantities, often just a few pounds at a time, but pay top dollar because they need consistent, chemical-free, well-dried material for tinctures and salves, and they value a direct relationship with the grower. Soap and skincare makers want calendula petals specifically, often in bulk if they're a larger operation, for infused oils and cold-processed soap. They tend to buy seasonally, stocking up once or twice a year. Tea companies want whole dried flowers or cut and sifted material, and while their per-pound price is often lower than the herbalist market, they can place larger recurring orders. Farmers markets and direct-to-consumer sales. Through an online shop, a farm stand, or a local health food store, let a grower sell small packaged quantities at retail prices, which is where the margins are highest per unit. Though volume is lower, Farmer Rosalind, on camera. We sell through all 4 of those channels, honestly. Direct-to-consumer through our website and a local farmers market gives us our best margins. But the herbalist and apothecary customers are what pay our bills reliably every single week. We built relationships with about a dozen local and regional herbal product makers over our first 2 years, and now most of our Echinacea crop is spoken for before we even harvest it. The real numbers visual. Simple on-screen graphic breaking down costs and revenue in a ledger-style table. Narrator. VO. Let's talk real numbers because vague promises of big profits don't help anybody. These figures come from a typical small-scale operation in an established 2nd or 3rd year once the perennial Echinacea beds are mature. On the calendula side of the operation, roughly a quarter to a third of an acre, or about 12,000 to 15,000 square feet of bed space. A well-managed planting can produce somewhere in the range of 300 to 500 pounds of fresh flower per season, which typically dries down to 80 to 130 pounds of finished dried product, since fresh flowers lose a significant amount of weight in water content during drying. Dried calendula flowers and petals commonly sell in a range from $20 to $60 per pound, depending on the buyer and whether it's whole flower or separated petals, with premium organic, hand-processed petals commanding the higher end of that range from herbalists and skincare makers. At a conservative average of $35 per pound and 100 pounds of dried product, that's roughly $3,500 in calendula revenue from a modest portion of the acre. On the Echinacea side, a mature planting on a similar amount of space can produce comparable or greater flower yields, and Echinacea flower typically sells in a similar or somewhat higher range than calendula, often $30 to $50 per pound dried, because of steady high demand from the immune support supplement market. If root harvest is added into the mix, dug from a portion of the planting in year 2 or 3, dried Echinacea root can command significantly higher prices, sometimes $40 to $80 per pound or more, because of the multi-year growing time required. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, when you add up flower sales from both crops, plus a partial root harvest from our oldest Echinacea beds, plus some direct retail sales at farmers markets where we get closer to full retail pricing, our total revenue last year was just over $52,000 from that 1 acre. Our direct costs, seed, soil amendments, a little bit of hired help during peak harvest, packaging materials, and farmers market fees came to right around $11,000. That left us with about $41,000 in profit. Visual. On-screen summary table category amount calendula flower revenue, about $9,000 Echinacea flower revenue, about $14. 000 Echinacea root revenue, partial harvest, about $12,000 direct retail farmers market sales, about $9,000 Missy. Value-added products, salves, teas, about $8,000 total gross revenue, about $52,000 seed, soil, amendments, about $1,800 labor, part-time seasonal help, about $6,500 packaging, jars, labels, about $1,200 farmers market fees, website, about $1. 0 drying processing supplies, about $500 total direct costs, about $11,000 net profit, about $41,000 aerator, VO. That's a 5-figure profit from 1 acre, not a fantasy projection, but a documented result from a real, working small farm. Your own numbers will vary depending on your climate, your local buyer network, your labor situation, and how much of the work you do yourself versus hiring out. But this gives you a realistic target and a realistic path. The first-year reality check visual. Rosalind looking through old notebooks and a rougher, less polished field from an earlier season. Narrator. VO. It's important to be honest that year 1 rarely looks like year 3. In the first year, Echinacea beds are establishing root systems rather than flowering heavily, so most of the revenue in year 1 tends to come from calendula and any other quick turnaround annual medicinal flowers a grower chooses to add, like chamomile or borage. Farmer Rosalind on camera. Our first year, we made about $9,000 total, mostly from calendula, and honestly we were still figuring out our drying process, so we lost a fair amount of product to mold before we got the airflow right. Year 2, once the Echinacea started flowering and we'd fixed our drying setup, we jumped to around $26,000. Year 3 is when we crossed $40,000. This is a business that compounds. The perennial beds get more productive, your buyer relationships deepen, and your processing efficiency improves every single season. Comer mistakes to avoid visual, a simple animated checklist appearing on screen as the narrator lists each point. Narrator, VO. A few mistakes come up again and again with new growers in this space, and avoiding them will save you real money and real heartache. First, underestimating drying infrastructure. Mold destroys product fast, and a rushed or improvised drying setup is the single most common cause of lost income in the first year. Second, planting before securing any buyers. It's wise to have at least a few conversations with local herbalists, soap makers, or tea companies before you're sitting on 100 pounds of dried flower with nowhere to sell it. Third, treating this as a plant it and walk away crop. Calendula in particular needs frequent harvesting to keep producing, and neglecting that harvest schedule can cut your yield dramatically. Fourth, ignoring quality standards. Buyers in this market, especially herbalists, care enormously about how flowers were grown, whether pesticides were used, and how carefully they were dried and stored. Building a reputation for clean, well-processed product is what turns one-time buyers into standing weekly or monthly orders. Getting started. Your first 90 days visual. A simple countdown graphic, day 1 through day 90, with milestones marked along the way. Narrator, VO. If you're standing at the very beginning of this, here's a simple roadmap for your first 90 days. In the first 2 to 3 weeks, test your soil, decide on your acre layout, and reach out to at least 5 to 10 potential local buyers, herbalists, soap makers, tea shops, and health food stores, just to understand demand and pricing in your specific region. In weeks 3 through 6, order your seed and any bare root Echinacea plants, and begin starting seed indoors if your timing calls for it. In weeks 6 through 10, prepare your beds, install irrigation if needed, and get your drying space built or converted. Even a simple setup with mesh racks and a box fan in a spare room can work for a first season. By day 90, in most temperate climates, you should have calendula transplants in the ground and Echinacea plants or divisions established, with your buyer conversations continuing in the background so that by the time your first flowers are ready, you already know where they're going. Farmer Rosalind, on camera. Closing shot, standing among the flowers at golden hour. I'm not going to tell you this is easy. There are early mornings, there's hand labor, there's a learning curve on drying and processing that cost us money in year 1. But I will tell you this. For the first time in our farming life, we are not at the mercy of a commodity price set by a market 1,000 miles away. We know exactly who is buying our flowers, we know exactly what they're worth, and we built that from One-Acre. If we can do it, you can do it too. How to approach your first buyers visual. Rosalind sitting at her kitchen table with a notebook, making a phone call. Then cut to her walking into a small apothecary shop with a sample box. Narrator, VO. A lot of new growers freeze up at this stage because selling feels unfamiliar compared to growing. The truth is that this part of the business is far simpler than it sounds. Farmer Rosalind, on camera. What worked for us was showing up with samples, not with a spreadsheet. I'd call ahead, introduce myself as a local grower, and ask if I could drop off a small sample of dried calendula or echinacea along with a one-page sheet listing what we grow and roughly how much we expect to have available. Most herbalists and soap makers were genuinely excited to meet a local grower, since a lot of their supply otherwise comes from distributors they've never spoken to. Narrator, VO. It also helps to ask questions rather than only pitch. What quality standards matter most to this buyer? What quantities do they typically need, and how often? These conversations build the relationship and tell you exactly what to grow more of next season. Farmer Rosalind, on camera. By the end of our first season, we had a simple list: buyer name, what they wanted, how much, how often, and their preferred price range. That list became the backbone of our planting plan for year 2. We stopped guessing what to grow and started growing to actual demand. Value-aided product and Higger Margins visual. A small kitchen workspace with mason jars of calendula-infused oil steeping on a sunny windowsill, then cut to finished tins of salve being labeled Narrator VO. Selling raw, dried flower is the simplest path into this business, but it isn't the only one. Many growers eventually add a small line of value-added products to capture even more profit from the same harvest. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, holding a finished tin of salve. Once we had extra calendula that wasn't already spoken for, we started infusing it into oil and making a simple healing salve, just calendula-infused olive oil, beeswax, and a bit of vitamin E. A pound of dried calendula that might sell raw for $35 can turn into a dozen or more finished salve tins that sell for $8 to $12 each at a farmer's market. That's a meaningful jump in value, though it means more labor and care around labeling. Narrator VO. Other common value-added options include simple herbal tea blends, infused honey, or small bundles of dried flowers sold for craft use. None require industrial equipment, but they do add labor hours, so most growers treat them as a way to use surplus material rather than the primary sales channel. Final thoughts visual. Wide, cinematic shot of the full acre at golden hour. Bees moving between Calendula and Echinacea blooms. Rosalind walking slowly along a row on Narrator VO. The broader lesson here goes well beyond just these two flowers. It's a lesson about matching the size of your land to the value of what you grow on it, rather than assuming that more acres always means more income. A single, well-managed acre of the right crop, sold directly to the people who value it most, can outperform ground many times its size. With less equipment, less debt, and far more control over your own income. Farmer Rosalind, on camera, final shot, standing among the flowers as the sun sets behind her. This acre changed how we think about farming, period. It's not about how much land you have. It's about what you grow on it, who you sell it to, and how much care you put into every step in between. 1 acre, done right, can change your whole operation. It changed ours. Visual. Slow fade to black over the flower field, text on screen. 1 acre, real flowers, real profit, end of script.